My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of Diplomatic Immunity. As always, I'm your host, Kelly McFarland, and today we're joined by a very special guest, journalist and author Anand Gopal. Anand is a three-time Pulitzer finalist for his work covering the war on terror and Middle Eastern politics. He's covered Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria very closely for the last decade. And as listeners know, we have been talking quite a bit about Syria lately with the fall of the Assad regime. And so I was very keen to talk to Anand about his new book, Days of Love and Rage, a story of ordinary people forging a revolution, which came out on March 3rd and follows ordinary Syrians navigating the civil war caught between the Assad regime and the rise of ISIS. So, Anand, thanks so much for joining us and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so I'm going to, jump in to my first question and sort of give you a chance to kind of, give listeners sort of an overview of the book. But I want to ask as we get into that, most people following the civil war and the rise of ISIS over the past 15 years has kind of focused on that macro level clash between the Assad regime and the rebel factions, and then the US and other forces against ISIS. But your book really kind of zeroes in on the northern city of Manbij and this sort of experiment that they had in democracy and how that was different from other parts of the country and everything. So what led you to this and sort of what is sort of the broad sort of swath of the book?
Well, I started reporting on Syria in late 2011. At that point, the country was already in rebellion. There was peaceful protests that were being gunned down by the Assad regime across the country. I went into small towns and villages and met with protesters and stayed with people while the government started bombing the cities. And I saw a lot of devastation and met people in some of the worst moments of their lives.
Yeah.
Uh, But in the course of those interviews, I heard a story of a city of Manbij, which, by the way, is a city in northern Syria, about a population 250,000 people. It's a place that most Syrians even weren't familiar with before 2011. Certainly, I wasn't familiar with it. And Manbij in mid 2012 managed to overthrow the Assad dictatorship just in their city, and proceeded to try to build a democracy from scratch. So I was really interested in that only because, surrounded by so much destruction and devastation, here's a story of people trying to construct something in the midst of what was turning out to be one of the world's deadliest civil wars. So that's kind of where I got started on this story. I spent 8 years, kind of after the democratic experiment failed, 8 years kind of tracking people down and meeting participants of the key events and reconstructing the story. So the book really tells the story of this experiment, which lasted 18 months, but it gives some of the backstory before 2011 and also what
Mhm.
happens after the experiment was finished, and follows the lives of 6 individuals.
Yeah. So before we get into the details and everything, you had mentioned the work you did to write this story. And as a historian, I'm interested in the sourcing that you had in this. So talk a little bit about that. What were your sources? What was it like trying to track down these people? I can only imagine, especially, it's not like you're running around New York City trying to find
Right.
people. Syria is still in a civil war this entire period after the fall of the democratic their trial in democracy. And and there's also issues as a historian, I'm very interested too in the idea of oral history and memory and how that might change or not change and how people view things after the fact. How did you, track these people down and how did you deal with that aspect of it being an oral history to a large extent and like these interviews in memory and how that might shift?
Yeah, when I started doing these interviews in 2016, so at that point, the democratic experiment had been over for 2 years, and ISIS had ruled for the intervening 2 years. It was now backed by US-backed Kurdish forces, the city. Um, and the people who had been the protagonists of the democratic experiment were now dispersed across Syria, in some cases as refugees in Turkey or even in Europe. So it took some effort to really track them down. What I found when I met them is exactly what you point out, which is that because these are events that are happening years in the past, some people had faulty memories, or sometimes people didn't necessarily want to remember everything because they feared that kind of dredging up this moment of hope was pointless since they were living under a dictatorship and Assad
Mhm.
was still in power at the time. Of course, they also, in addition to the fragility of memory, you have the you find that people will try to retell their stories sometimes in a selective way. They'll write
Yeah.
things selected. It's natural. Um, what I realized pretty quickly is that I was not able to do this alone, especially as an outsider. And I began recruiting people who themselves had witnessed or taken part in the democratic uprising as research assistants. At the peak, probably I had hired something like 14 different researchers who fanned out across the country and across the region to track down people who were their own former neighbors and
Mhm.
comrades and friends and lovers. And so they were able to win the trust of some of these individuals and get them to open up. But it also meant that for every scene that I described in the book, I had 10 or 15 or 20 different sources.
Yeah.
Um, in addition to that, Syria was possibly the first conflict that played out partly on social media
Mhm.
because protesters were going out and filming things with their phones. So many key moments in the history of this democratic experiment were actually documented in the videographic record or were documented in the pages of local newspapers. So when the dictatorship was overthrown, people created newspapers from scratch. And keep in mind, Syria is a place that had no freedom of speech before 2011. All the newspapers were state-run newspapers. So protesters were essentially mimeographing sheets and putting together, stapling together newspapers and handing them out on street corners and or teaching themselves the basics of InDesign, for instance, on the computer.
Yeah.
So almost a dozen newspapers appeared during this 18-month period. They
Wow.
ranged from left-wing newspapers to conservative and religious newspapers. So I was able to track down all these newspapers essentially. So I had this really massive corpus of data, which is tens of thousands of pages, which were kind of a in real time history of the events by individuals who participated in them, as well as we did up to almost 2,000 interviews overall. So with all these different sources of information, we were able to triangulate uh, with the different sources and come to I hope is a reasonable approximation of what happened.
Yeah, it's interesting, the level of, tracking down sources and looking at different kind of sources to get, as close an approximation as you can, I think is commendable. And especially, as you noted and I noted, doing it within a country that's, fighting the Assad regime at the same time and ISIS, just fascinating stuff. So let's get to the experiment in democracy. So kind of explain to us a little bit of the sort of lead up to the initiation of this democracy, and then maybe go through sort of the point, the early stages up until it started to break down, and then we'll get into the breakdown
Okay.
after that. But yeah,
Sure. So protests started in Manbij in 2011 at the same time that it started everywhere else in Syria. And in the
yeah,
beginning, it was a small group of protesters. Remember, it was a city of 250,000 people. You maybe had 50 protesters who were going out every Friday and getting shot at by security forces. They were getting arrested, brutalized in prisons, and then released. And then they would go back and protest again. Slowly over the course of 2011 and the first half of 2012, they were able to win the allegiance of the majority of the city. And in part, this was because people saw the government forces shooting at their neighbors, their relatives. The government in the beginning were saying these uprisings are they're controlled by terrorists.
mhm,
They're funded by the CIA. And a lot of people believed them because they had no reason not to. This is
right,
coming from official sources. But seeing with their own eyes their neighbors and their relatives and their friends being shot at and saying, "Wait a second, these aren't terrorists, these are our friends." More and more people began to come out. And so by 2012, this is a year into the protest movement, what started as just a 50 people became tens of thousands of people every Friday. At that point, mid 2012, the Syrian regime was facing this situation in 100 different places around the country. And so
yeah,
they had to retrench and focus on the really key strategic areas like Aleppo and the places near Aleppo and the places near Damascus. So the sort of out of the way towns and cities like Manbij, they just withdrew from. What that meant is overnight, the protesters and the people of Manbij faced a situation in which they had a city without a government, but there was trash that needed to be picked up. There were streets that need to be cleaned, lights that need to be kept on, schools that needed to be opened. And so they had to figure out, how do we do this? It was basically the exigencies of this kind of extreme moment that they banded together. There was something called the Revolutionary Council, which was a body composed of protesters, which took power in the city. They began to run the city almost as a mini city state. They enacted laws. They put forth a taxation scheme. They tried to open schools, and they had to regulate the various armed factions that were appearing. And in that early period, that's from mid 2012, the first 6 months into 2013, you saw a real explosion of popular expression. Um, Syria was 40 years of dictatorship where you could not open a chess club. You could not,
Mhm.
participate in a football league. You could not do anything without the permission of the authorities. There was no independent civil society whatsoever. Now, for the first time, independent civil society organizations began to appear. There was the creation of what were called assemblies. These were They ran the gamut from occupational groupings to political clubs to charities. So, example, there would be a teachers' assembly, blacksmiths' assembly, farmers' assembly. There are also politically left and right wing assemblies. So it was each of these assemblies became these, I call them in the book, mini parliaments of the people, where people would go and debate over the issues that pertained to, whether if it was a teachers' assembly, the issues that pertained to education. You know, and e- eventually there was a movement within the city to turn this kind of bottom up participatory governance into a formal democracy by having elections. Now, the problem was that the Assad regime was continuing to bomb the city
Mhm.
throughout this period. So you couldn't have long ballot lines, or the regime would
Right.
just bomb them. So they had to come up with a workaround. What they did is they figured out that, well, actually, it was in the assemblies. We could vote inside the assemblies for delegates to some citywide assembly, and that citywide assembly would run the city. And that anybody who was a citywide delegate would be subject to instant recall if they weren't doing their job. Any citizen can go in front of this assembly and submit suggestions or submit complaints about how things were going in the city. So it was a type of participatory democracy, very different from what we're used to, where we think of democracy as something that happens every 2 or 4 years when you go to
Mhm.
the ballot box. Here, the understanding was democracy required the active participation of citizens. And so that brings us to the 2013, where the sort of contradictions within this democracy began to emerge.
Yeah, so let's get into those contradictions. And one of your main arguments in the book is that obviously tyranny is a threat to democracy, but inequality might be even the bigger threat. And a lot of times those go hand in hand for obvious reasons. But it's not like we don't have inequality in the United States as well. But how did that come into play in Manbij? And as things started to break down, what were the main factors driving that?
So the protesters who risked their lives uh, did so for the concept of freedom, and so everybody would march in the name of freedom.
Mhm.
And once the Revolutionary Council took power, it was also in the name of freedom. And in the beginning, everybody was united behind this idea, but very quickly, moving from freedom as an idea of resistance to one as a practical matter of governance, there began to appear fissures in the very idea of what freedom means. Right? So
Mhm.
for the Revolutionary Council, for the leadership of the city, freedom meant freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, also freedom of markets. And for many of the poor and working class members of the city, they supported freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. But freedom of markets was more complicated because prices were rising at the grocery store,
Mhm.
um, partly because of the war, and partly because the overthrow of the government led to the end of some of the subsidies that the
Right.
government had put in place. The cost of fuel was rising, and most importantly, the cost of bread was rising, and bread is the staple of the
Mhm.
Syrian diet. As well, at the same time, Syrians from other cities were fleeing to Manbij because it was relatively peaceful and safe, and so there was a population spike, and this led to pressures on rent, and so rent started to spiral. So it's a real, what we began to see was a real cost of living affordability crisis. And there began to be demands from some sections of the revolutionary movement for price controls, for more progressive taxation on the wealthy, for more extreme measures like taking over apartments that have been empty and giving them to people who were homeless. While these demands are coming primarily from more working class and poor members of society, the leaders of the Revolutionary Council, who tended to be from the merchant class, who tended to be from the wealthier segments of society, viewed these kinds of controls, price controls and others, as an anathema to their conception of freedom.
Right.
And so that's where a real divide began to emerge between the two sides.
So then who sort of steps in to fill the void then as this starts to break down?
So now we're in April 2013. This is 10 months into the democratic experiment. 6 individuals come into the city. They're foreigners, they're not Syrians, and they set up shop. And they realize, they look at the city and they see it's really divided. And the division is on the question of security, both material security or economic security and physical security, because that crime is also rampant. And they carefully wage what you could call a populist campaign, basically saying, look, the problems in the city, the economic precarity and crime, is due to the fact that the people who run the city, the revolutionaries who run the city, are beholden to alien Western ideas of freedom. They call them liberals, essentially. That what we need is to go back to our own traditions and look at the ways we've solved these problems ourselves. And they say, look at the early generations of Muslims, the early Islamic caliphates, how they solved it. And what they claimed was, in the early Islamic caliphate of 1,000 years ago, there was no rich or poor. You could leave your doors open at night. Everybody was provided for. The role of the state was to provide for the least among us. And that message began to gain traction, especially as you go through the summer of 2013. And now the prices are going through the roof, especially the price of bread, which jumped, I think, up to 300% from a year before. So you had a real economic crisis, and these 6 individuals began to recruit people in the city, and eventually they revealed themselves to be ISIS. And so ISIS grows in strength from 6 people. Within 6 months, they have thousands of people who support them. And this is all through rhetoric, through politics, through mass mobilization, not through force of arms. Ultimately, the crisis in the city comes to a point where it's the majority of the population turns against the revolutionary leadership and looks to ISIS for deliverance. And ISIS is able to take over the city. And once they do, they install a new type of tyranny, which dissolves democracy altogether.
Yeah, and it's what's fascinating about the book too is that you're telling this broader story, but you're also following a handful of individuals and telling their stories as you go through this to get to the bigger story. And to your point here, 2 best friends you follow in this story are eventually torn apart by this political polarization. One moving toward the revolution, another one moving toward ISIS. So in your reporting and as you were telling this story, was this something that was like a slow shift over time, or was it a pragmatic response to what was going on the ground? As you were just noting that, the increase in the cost of bread and this rhetoric makes sense, right? When people are dealing with these issues. So was it a mix of both, or, that they were already sort of in line in their thinking to quickly jump on to one ship or the other? Or, how did that play out as sort of a microcosm of the bigger movements on both sides?
We tend to think about people who join ISIS, for example, as getting radicalized on YouTube and going off and joining, and um, they were already beholden to extremist ideas by the time they join, and that does happen sometimes, of course. But what I found, and we interviewed maybe 70 or so members of ISIS for the book, and what I found again and again and again is actually the typical trajectory in the Syrian revolution, at least, is that you have ordinary people, often who are taking part in the revolution for democracy. So one of the characters you mentioned in the book, Abdul Hadi, we meet him in the book. He's a secular pro-democracy protester. As a teenager, he had affairs with boys. He was a trained to be a pro football player, a
Mhm.
pro soccer player. Um, Not the type of person you would expect to end up in ISIS, but he
Right.
does. Throughout, and you find out through the book that the course of the book he does. And there was many people I interviewed, my team interviewed, who had a similar trajectory. And when looking at what that trajectory was, it was almost always the case that they were responding to very mundane, practical, this worldly issues, but looking for a story to tell about why they're seeing what they're seeing. So massive inequality. What's
Mhm.
what's the reason? What's the story? And often they gravitated to those who had the most compelling stories. And in this case, with the massive inequality, the one side, the revolutionary leadership, really didn't have a story to tell. They were saying, "Well, the market's going to correct itself. You're going to
Right.
be fine." The other side was painting a picture and telling a coherent narrative that drew from elements of their own culture. You know, so what ISIS was able to do was to recognize that the the real conditions people were living under and give them a story that, no matter what, had a kernel of truth. The kernel of truth was that um, there is something unjust about the way things are happening right now. And then a plausible response to that kernel of truth, which is, well, we need to go back to how things used to be. And so people join ISIS, but it's usually after they joined that they got socialized into the norms of the group, and became what the more typical image of the radical jihadi.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating story, not just for Syria, but just how people become radicalized in general.
Yeah,
And oftentimes, I think it's important to remember, as you note, that a lot of times these people aren't radicals from an ideological standpoint or a religious standpoint. They're, they're understanding the inequality that they live in and the fact that they can't afford bread and that something needs to change. And and they go to the side that seems like they're going to be able to offer them something. And we see that all over the place, not just in Syria.
absolutely, absolutely.
So another aspect is, as this is occurring in the 2012, 2013, 2014 time period, it's all kind of happening also in like a diplomatic void, in the terms of any sort of outside power being involved or around or focusing on this because of other issues that are going on. What effect did that have, if any, on the outcome, the eventual outcome of what happened?
So one of the big questions early on was the question of funding,
Mhm.
how to fund services in the city. Then the Revolutionary Council did not want to tax people, especially merchants and others. Instead, they really preferred to get funding from abroad. They didn't always succeed in that, but if you look at the classic story of from sociological history, uh, states that aren't able to tax their own population end up becoming beholden to foreign interests in a way. And so this was something that happened in some other cities in Syria. For example, had similar types of experiments. And then if you also look at the rebel factions, there were certain rebel factions who were, you would call them secular Free Syrian Army rebel groups, that really wanted support from the West and didn't really get it.
Mm.
And they had to, but if you're a rebel faction, you have to pay for guns, you have to pay for the
Right.
upkeep of your soldiers. So if you're not going to get the support from the West, you're going to try to get it from elsewhere. Some of them turned to banditry. Some of them just started setting up checkpoints and shaking down motorists, and that's
Mm.
how they funded themselves, which led to the kind of insecurity and lack of law and order, which for, were the fertile grounds for the growth of
Right.
law and order groups like ISIS to come to emerge. Right, other groups chose not to do that and turned instead to the Gulf states. So Qatar is the
Mhm.
most important example. Kuwait, or Turkey, not a Gulf state, but
Yeah.
and so these groups would do so, but they were Islamist in nature. And so you had this situation where you had Islamist groups that were pretty well stocked. You had then secular groups that were not and were basically taking part in banditry.
Mhm.
Then you have ISIS emerge in the city and say, well, secularism and liberalism, look what it's brought you. It's brought you this banditry. It's an Islamic way is much better. And people would look at some of these Islamic groups and say, well, they're not the ones shaking us down the
Right.
street. So maybe there's something to this.
Yeah. And you also tell the story of a mother in this book as well. And obviously, the gender aspect of this story isn't one that's really talked about very much because it was because of the focus, at least in the West, on the fighting and
Yeah.
the Assad regime and then the battle against ISIS. So, how did that play a role in this revolutionary movement? And then obviously when ISIS came in, that was a different story. But during these early periods, what was her story in all of this?
So I profile a woman named Mina, who when we meet her in the book, she's a housewife and mother, and has never really thought much about politics. Was kind of vaguely supportive of the Assad regime, but didn't really think much of it. Was focused on her family. The protests start. Her younger brother gets caught up in the protests. He gets arrested and is tortured pretty horrifically. And this turns a switch in her. And he drops out of the movement after the torture, but this turns a switch in her. And she begins to see uh, everything around her as she begins to see the regime and the oppression of the regime and everything around her. And so she organizes a group of women and goes out and protests. This is when the regime was still in power, and doing so was incredibly courageous for two reasons. One, just anybody who protested against the regime was courageous
Yeah.
because they would be shot or tortured. But two, Manbij is a pretty conservative tribal city with pretty conservative social mores, fairly patriarchal system, and so she was in a way standing up not only to the Assad regime but also against the patriarchal norms of her own
Mhm.
society. When the regime was overthrown from the city and the democratic period was there, she was one of the women who organized women's assembly. There were several women's assemblies that appeared in this time, and they played a pretty important role in various parts of the basic workings of the democracy there. But again, the same challenge was that these women are fighting almost a two-front battle: one against
Right.
the regime, and the other against their own comrades, their own fellow revolutionaries, the chauvinism of the fellow revolutionaries. And so, Mina's assembly was called Women of Freedom, and the idea was to promote a vision of gender equality while also fighting for the ideals of democracy that the revolution had initially formulated.
So I'm going to get you out of here on one last question, and it's a kind of a big one. But your the book and your title even suggests this. There's a extremely broad emotional arc in this. I mean, Days of Love and Rage is the title, and we're now 15 years on, amazingly, from the initial Arab Spring uprisings in the Middle East and in Syria, and we've had the overthrow of the Assad regime and a new government in place. So what is your takeaway from all of this, and where is Manbij today?
So the regime was overthrown in 2024, and a rebel group, Islamist rebel group, has taken power. And from one perspective, you say, well, okay, people fought, 600,000 people died, and yes, Assad is gone, but it's not like Syria, Switzerland,
Right,
right?
right.
So there's still so many problems. Was it all worth it? It's a question I try to interrogate in the book, and I ask the people I follow, was it worth it? Um, from one perspective, of course not. Maybe it would have been
Mhm.
better for no one to have risen up, and all these families would still be intact and homes still standing. On the other hand, if you look at the history of democracies, and I do a comparison in the book between France and Syria. France had the Great French Revolution,
Yeah.
which ended in a dictatorship, in an emperor, and then another revolution, and uh, led to a king, and then another revolution, and another one. It took several revolutions. Each one was kind of building on the previous one, and each one had carved out more space for ordinary people to rule themselves, until you culminated in something like a modern democracy by
Mhm.
by the early 20th century. So, I think some of the revolutionaries that I've interviewed, they see their struggles not ending
Right.
with the overthrow of Assad, but that maybe this will be continued by their children and their children's children. That the fight for democracy is one that's kind of enduring, and what the book shows is the ways in which the sacrifices of ordinary people can build towards something that outlasts them.
Yeah, in many ways, it's a story that's still being told. So,
Exactly.
yeah. But well, listen, Anand, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about the book. It's highly recommend Days of Love and Rage. Fascinating book. a really important point in Syria right now too. So I think it's a good time to sort of look back and see what's happened over the past 15 years. And yeah, I can't recommend it enough. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.